All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining today's Hacking Exposed webinar. My name is Brian Robison, and I'm going to be your speaker today. Unfortunately, Stuart is a little bit busy this week, so he is not able to join us today, but he will from time to time in future Hacking Exposed webinars. Again, my name is Brian Robison. I'm the Chief Evangelist here at Cylance, and I think we're going to have a little bit of fun today in today's Hacking Exposed webinar. Now, over the past few quarters, we have done several of these, but the great thing is that with the wonderful staff that we have on board with webinars and our digital marketing team, we are going to be on a pretty awesome regular cadence of these coming along the pipe over the next few months. So stay tuned on the webinars page on our cylance.com site or the Hacking Exposed page as well, and they will hopefully provide a little bit of future directions coming around the Hacking Exposed webinars. Also, we do have some live events happening around the world, and keep an eye out for those as well. So before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping thing. I will try to answer question and answer questions throughout the webinar, definitely at the end, hopefully if I can see them. Depending on what I'm doing, I may not be able to do that, as I'm just kind of running this as a one-man show today. So to enter questions, you will see a Q&A widget in the Zoom bar on your presentation. And so please go ahead and enter any questions you may have, and we will try to address them throughout the presentation or at the very end. So today's agenda, as we have looked at a lot of the Hacking Exposed webinars in the past, our goal is to uncover and essentially expose some of the adversarial techniques and tools that are used throughout, hacking an endpoint. And over the past several Hacking Exposed webinars that we have done, we have shown kind of individual techniques. We've shown things like DLL sideloading and injection, and we've shown use of other tools to bypass traditional AV. Now, the interesting thing is today, we're actually going to kind of combine all of these things together into a full-on endpoint attack. So we are actually going to model today's attack against the MITRE attack framework, which is a great framework to basically have an idea and understanding of different elements used in different phases of an attack. So we are going to go hands-on as we do with Hacking Exposed. We're going to go hands-on. We're going to build out a C2 command and control system. We're going to talk about some different methods of bypassing defenses. We're going to weaponize our tools, and we're going to establish foothold on a hapless victim system. And we're going to combine all the different elements together, and we're going to, as a main goal, we're going to exfiltrate some data off of the endpoint, and we're then going to leave it in a ransomed state, essentially, to try to monetize our action even beyond the data that we attempt to exfiltrate. Now, as with all Hacking Exposed tools and techniques that we do, we are using fully open source and available tools. We are not using anything that is hidden or custom built. So the idea here is that you will be able to also perform these exact techniques and tests within your own networks to help improve your own security posture and your red teaming exercises that you may do inside your organization. So basically, yep, I just said that. I apologize. I didn't realize I had even a slide on this. But basically, the idea here, again, is to give you these simulations. And so, adversarial simulation and emulation are becoming a bigger critical part of our security. And you need to be able to internally test. Now, the cool thing is today, we're actually going to be using, again, we're going to put together an entire attack. And that means all the way from, let's say, the email vector, what the email looks like that the victim is going to get. So a lot of these different pieces can be used, and I have no problem with any of you taking, you're going to get recordings of this, you're going to get the deck as well, but feel free to use exact text that I have on the screen if you want, or even modify some of the social engineering things that I have created here. What I've created are modeled after real world attacks that we have seen in the real world. And so I have sometimes changed or even changed the grammar on some of the text to make it a little bit more understandable, but it's essentially modeled after real world stuff that's happening out there. All right, so as you all know, MITRE attack framework is becoming a great framework to essentially understand the behavioral mapping of what adversaries go through to gain access to your system. So it gives you, those phases of an adversary lifecycle. So whether it's creating a command and control, or tools to obfuscate malware, or whatever you're going to use, the framework gives you a good mapping of how we can modify or go through the behavior of an actual adversary and attack. And obviously the goal of that is, if you understand the different behavioral techniques, you're going to be able to better put in place defenses, and then be able to use testing to validate and verify those. So today we're actually going to go through an APT3 emulation behavior. And so we're not going to necessarily do every single one of the steps that are in the APT3 emulation plan, but we are going to go through several of them. And so our presentation and webinar today are kind of broken up into 3 different segments. Our first step is we're going to build some of our bad stuff, and we're going to establish and set up our C2, our command and control, on the back end to listen. Then in step 2, we're actually going to compromise the host through our initial infection vector. And then on step 3 is when we're going to go through and gather more data exfiltrated off of the host. And then we'll add one further behavior to this, which is we're going to leave the host in a severely compromised state by having some ransomware installed. So let's go ahead and begin our setup. So in this step, again, like I said before, we're going to start by building something that is designed to bypass defenses that are out there. And we're going to use some previous techniques that we have done. So obviously we can use things that we've talked about before, like DLL sideloading or injection. We can use obfuscation of malware by packing it. We can exploit vulnerable applications. All these different methods that we have actually utilized before to bypass different ways of getting past those endpoint security solutions. So today, we are going to use one of the tools that we have used in the past. It's called Shelter, and we're going to use that tool to inject some shellcode directly into the memory of our victim. Now, our victim is a traditional victim, and we'll pop over to that here in a few seconds. But we're also going to use an oldie but goodie, and this has been around for a long time. In fact, it's referenced in several of Stuart's very first editions of the Hacking Exposed book. But basically, we're going to use Shelter to inject our shellcode directly into memory from a legitimate program. But then, like I said, we're going to use an oldie but goodie called file pumping. Now, back in the early days of antivirus scanning and things like that, a lot of vendors put in, or had to put in, performance type of trade-offs in their products. And essentially, these trade-offs can, even as of today, still be exploited. And so what we're going to exploit today is actually the file size. So a lot of vendors, including a lot of the current next generation vendors and people that you see out there today building the next greatest solutions, will have a performance kind of block inside of their application, or maybe they don't want to upload a large application to the cloud. So using file pumping, we're actually going to make the file large enough that a lot of the traditional AV and as well as a lot of the next-gen security tools will simply ignore it because of its file size. Now, the cool thing is we don't actually have to make it very big. We just have to make it big enough. And especially if you know what type of security products your intended victim are running, again, you can just make that file the size that would simply, bypass that product. All right, so we're going to make something invisible and we're going to bulk it up. So let's go ahead and switch over. We're now switched over to kind of our demo systems, and many of you have seen the Hacking Exposed webinars in the past, and you're going to see some similar type of tools being used. This box here, we have a Windows box running, and this is essentially our hacker box. This is going to be our system that we're going to use to build some of our tools. And then over on the left hand, I've got a couple of Linux shells logged into my Kali Linux box, and we're going to use some parts of this to do some of the tests. So we're going to use Metasploit framework as our command and control today. And we could always use other command and controls. One that I really like to use, and you're going to see it more in the future, we did use it a couple of webinars back, is called Trevor C2. Now, Trevor C2 is kind of like Metasploit, but it was built to bypass the tools that can simply detect Metasploit signatures. So a lot of tools out there today have specific signatures written in their products to detect Metasploit. And the problem with that is that if you're trying to test your defenses, if you simply trigger one of the built-in rules using Metasploit, then you're game over, but you're not really testing the ability of the defense tool to actually protect you in that environment. So Trevor C2, if you want more information about that one, I believe we did that one back in June of this year. It's a very cool command and control, hides in plain sight, very difficult to detect. But today, we're going to go ahead and use Metasploit. So the first thing we need to do is we need to find a tool that we're going to use to establish our command and control. So we're going to use Metasploit as our command and control, but we're going to need some way of executing that reverse interpreter on the Windows victim. And so we can use a lot of different tools. We've talked about using Shelter before, and we've actually used it, but Shelter needs to inject itself into a legitimate program. Now, one of the kind of the cool tools that I like to use for a legitimate tool is something like auto runs. So if we go download auto runs from sysinternals, we'll simply grab our auto runs, and we'll just grab the 32-bit version of auto runs. The interesting thing is Shelter will basically only work with a 32-bit version of an exe. So we could use other programs, but as you begin using Shelter, you're going to realize that some programs work better than others. So it's you want to make sure that you do testing to make sure that you actually can build a tool that actually works. So just a quick overview of what Shelter is. So Shelter is a dynamic shellcode injection tool. And what that means is it's going to inject shellcode, which what we're going to use for our shellcode today is the Metasploit interpreter, into a native Windows application. And that application happens to be our auto runs exe over here that we just downloaded and grabbed. So Shelter is a really cool program because it takes advantage of the original structure of the PE, of the actual executable file. It doesn't add any modifications, such as changing memory access permission, or even adding additional sections with read-write access, read-write execute access, rather, and other things that make this new executable look really dodgy to kind of AV or endpoint security. So it actually uses the dynamic execution flow of the program here, which is auto runs, and it tries to find a location to insert an instruction and redirect the execution to the payload that we're going to build in. So it's kind of smart. It's a really cool tool. And the great thing is when you do shellcode injection, a lot of times you're going to end up with a program that crashes or doesn't work right. It doesn't look like it should look. Shelter does a great job of finding a great place to put your shell code and execute it such that the original program essentially runs just like it normally should. So we're going to run this in automatic mode. We're not going to check for an online update. And to pick our PE target, we just simply drag and drop auto runs on top here, and it'll go ahead and pick the path. Now, as I said before, it's going to go ahead and start, it's actually going to execute auto runs, and it's going to look for places in the execution to hide the shellcode. And you can see here, it's going to run a bunch of instructions for a period of time. And so while that does that, we're going to go ahead and flip over to our Kali Linux box over here, and we're going to set up our Metasploit C2. All right, so we are going to use an exploit, and we are going to set up the parameters. So we have to set up our listener first. Oops. So we're going to listen on an IP, and we also need to set our port, and then we need our payload. And today we're going to use Windows Interpreter, and we're going to use reverse HTTP. So we could also use reverse TCP or HTTPS or any of the other payloads, but today we're just going to use a simple reverse HTTP. Now, by doing this, this is where things like network intrusion prevention, some smarter firewalls will have signatures to detect Metasploit. So at that point, you will be able to catch Metasploit on the wire. But if you were then to switch over to HTTPS, or if you were to use even something like Trevor C2, then you can actually hide pretty much in plain sight. All right, we're going to now start our listener. So our command and control is now listening on this IP, and it's listening on this port number. All right. So over here on our worker box, Shelter has figured out where it needs to inject the shellcode. It's traced a whole bunch of instructions, and we're going to go ahead and finish the completion of it. So we're going to establish our stealth mode. And so again, the payload that you want to put in here, you can put your own, or you can use one of the existing payloads that are built in. And so we already are, we've already got our Metasploit console over here listening using a reverse HTTP. So we need to basically put the same payload into our auto runs program over here. So from the list, we're going to choose option number 2. And then again, we have to tell it where to communicate with. So we communicate with our IP address and our port number. And it's now going to go ahead and do its job, its magic, and it's going to stuff all that in and be ready to go. And we want to make sure that we get our injection verified, which is good. We have that, and we press continue. And so now we basically have a new copy of auto runs, and it is going to look like auto runs, smell like auto runs, and it's actually going to taste like auto runs when we actually execute it. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is, obviously, if we were to send somebody an EXE or they were going to download it over HTTP, a lot of inline scanners are then going to look inside this file. However, a lot of times, all we really have to do is change the dot extension on the file. And in a lot of cases, we can actually bypass some of those elements of security. Now, also, we've created a file here that somebody might be able to be tricked into double-clicking on. And so just by simply changing it to a familiar icon, then potentially we can cause a little havoc with this. Now, we're going to move this over. We're going to drop it in our little drop box over here, and that's going to put it up on an FTP site. So my next thing I'm going to do is I've already created a website, and I've already sent out our mouse spam campaigns and things like that. And we're going to go over those different elements here in a moment. But what I'm going to do right now is I need to stage up this our new XLS file. I need to stage it onto a web server so that it can be downloaded by our victim in a few moments. So the first thing we got to do is we got to get it over here to our web server. So bear with me a moment here while I copy this file over. So we're just going to copy this file over. And if we take a look at this, let's do, okay, you'll see that the file is only 703K in size. Now, as I talked before, what we're going to do is we're actually going to bump this file up in size to a point where hopefully, you know, our endpoint security products may simply ignore it. And usually a good size to shoot for is something larger than 20 or 30 megabytes in size. So I've got on here, I've got a nice little Python script that's going to go basically add a bunch of fake data to this file. So we can simply just execute it. I call it pumper. And we're going to pump up small by 30 megs, and we're going to call it xls. Okay, so now if we look at this, we've got small at 703K, and we now have xls sitting at a little over 30 megabytes. So we've basically added 30 megabytes of junk data to this executable, and that, in a lot of cases, oddly enough, especially products that rely on cloud services, is essentially enough to bypass the tool, and it won't look at it, or it won't upload it for further analysis or whatever, simply due to performance reasons. Okay, so now that we have our xls established, we are then going to do one last thing over here. We're going to start up a quick, just a simple web server that we're going to be able to use to take a look at some of our exfiltrated data. We're going to put this on port 8090. Okay. Now, at this point, we have completed setting up our command and control. We have Metasploit listening. It's getting ready to establish a connection to our victim. We have built our, not really malware, but we have built our shellcode into a legitimate program that we're going to trick the user into running. And we also have a little web server set up and running that we're going to use to review some of the data that we're going to exfiltrate off of the system. So with that, we're going to switch back over, and we're going to talk a little bit about the next kind of phase of the attack, which is we're moving into now establishing a foothold. Okay, so in theory, let's talk about different methods that we can use to establish a foothold in a victim network or a victim system. Obviously, there are easier and more scalable approaches, and there are also more complex, higher risk type of approaches. The most common, which are what I call lots of noise with few results, are the traditional mouse spam campaigns, spear phishing email campaigns. Maybe you drive-by compromise. You have a compromised website that you can replace a downloaded or download program in. Whatever you're going to do, these are some of the relatively easier methods to kind of get that host to be compromised. Obviously, some of the more complex type of things, and that you need to be a little bit more invisible on, are things like, you know, supply chain compromise, third-party relationships, you know, potentially, you know, obtaining or gaining valid credentials on a system. Those are going to be a little bit, you know, higher levels of you know, complexity required over just a kind of a blast and spray and pray, if you will, on a mouse spam campaign. So what we're going to actually choose today as our kind of initial infection vector is we're going to choose a spray and pray method. So setting up for this, I have already sent out, you know, to my intended victims an email containing a weaponized document. But this weaponized document is nothing like maybe you have ever seen before. It's not the traditional type of weaponized document that we see every day. And we're going to go into how that is actually built so that you can actually utilize this in your own testing. Now, obviously, weaponized documents are great to be sending out to softer targets, if you will, is what I call them in an organization. And these are things like HR, finance, accounts receivable, accounts payable. These departments receive unsolicited attachments, relatively common. And so a lot of the times these are really good ways to, if you're going to be, doing some testing internally, obviously sending, mouse spam or weaponized documents to your security team is going to hopefully result in really good, defense. However, if you start sending them to softer targets that will normally receive these type of attachments from external sources, or even sending it to them at home addresses, can be easy ways to find out, how well your user education programs are going. Now, as I said, this is a little bit of a different flavor. And what this is actually based on is it's based upon emails that have been being blasted out by the Necker's botnet over the past few months. We started seeing this earlier in 2018 in the spring. It really picked up heat in the summer, and by now it's pretty much died off, but it's still a very interesting technique because it's going to be utilizing some really, really old features and a different way to kind of bypass the human, get past some of the social engineering type of stuff that we have done. Now, if you have never heard of this, this is called an IQY file. Now, an IQY file, it's an interesting thing. It's been around for a long time, but what it is, and if you build it in a text editor, as you can see here on the right, this is the exact file that we're using today. I built it in Notepad, and it essentially includes some garbage, but mostly it includes a URL that is going to actually go download a file and attempt to do what that file says to do directly in the Excel document itself. So this is a relatively old feature in Excel, and it's something that not a lot of people have seen before. And it's also not a traditional weaponized document that actually has the malware built into it. So it's not picked up by, anti-malware, email engines and things like that. It's just simply, this is the only thing that is included in the file. And with the .iqy extension, it actually loads directly into Excel. So this is the .iqy file that we've actually attached as an attachment to our mouse spam campaign. We don't have to zip protect it. We don't have to do anything. We just attached it as is. Again, the file doesn't contain any malware. This is the only data that is inside this entire file. Now, this is pointing to an internal site within the demo environment here that I have. So this is not a publicly available URL, but again, really all I did was change the URL. Even the names of the file, the 2.dat, the 1.dat that we're going to show you in a minute here, are directly from some of the actual uses of this in the real world today. All I did was change the URL to point to a website that I control versus a website that they controlled. Okay, so the IQY file is going to download this file called 2.dat. Now, what 2.dat actually has in it is essentially an Excel formula that's going to execute a command directly within the cell of the document. So in this case, we're going to execute command exe, and that's going to execute PowerShell. And what it's going to do is it's going to download into that cell this file called 1.dat and run a script called 1.dat. So this is interesting because of the way this command is formulated, this text file sitting on the website. Excel will attempt to execute this on behalf of you, the user. Okay, so 2.dat is going to go download 1.dat. Now, 1.dat is actually kind of where the bomb is. And it's not traditional VB script code. It's not going to use, WScript interpreter. So it's actually not even going to pop up the yellow enable macros bar that we have seen with previous weaponized attachments, and that we have all trained our users that, unless you really know this document, you should not click on the enable macros. So this technique actually does not utilize that mechanism. Now, there are warnings that pop up, but in a lot of cases, your users will not be trained or not have not seen that warning before. They're looking for the yellow bar. And so this could take advantage of that. So one.dat gets downloaded and executed in that cell. And as you can see here at the top, it's going to download that 31 megabyte version of uh-oh.xls. It's going to save it to the local system, and then it's actually going to then execute uh-oh.xls. Now, if you remember, that is not malware. It's simply a copy of autoruns that we use Shelter to build and inject some shellcode into, so that hopefully when it runs, we should actually get our command and control established back to Metasploit. And so that's what we're going to go do right now. Now, as I said before, we have already kind of, sent out this email. We've already created the IQY file. We've got all the 1.dat and the 2.dat. They're staged on the web server right next to the uh-oh.xls file. And so very quickly here, let's just pop over to our victim. Now, as I said before, this is our hapless victim. And if you've seen us use these victims before, it's a very common type of system. There are lots of different files on the system. You've got pictures of a nice snowy driveway. You've got some personal documents like your federal 1040 form. You've got some work documents like your channel marketing spreadsheet. You've got resumes. You've got all kinds of mix of documents on this machine that might be valuable for somebody to get a hold of. So I have already, like I said, I've already sent out our malspam blast, and it happens to actually come from our friend Stuart McClure. Now, obviously, Stuart McClure, to me, is a trusted individual. He's the CEO and the co-founder of Cylance, so I would pay attention to this email. Now, this is also, this email will contain some very common techniques utilized by people out there to try to bypass an end user's training. And so things, that are said here, like, obviously this is our latest unpaid invoice. So there's some, excitement coming in here that we need to get this invoice paid. Now, it also explains that the document automatically connects and self-authenticates directly into their accounting system to show the latest invoice. Now, obviously that might be something really cool, but it also might be something bad. But the idea here is that we're telling this user that it's okay that this is going to connect to something else. And here in bold, it's kind of one of the ringers. It may warn you about these external connections, but they must be allowed for this automated invoice to work. So please accept these warnings. Again, this is just a different way of trying to trick the end user into actually ignoring those warnings from Microsoft and actually executing the file. Now, obviously, this is very common as well. Email has been scanned. Any attachments have been scanned by antivirus and are clean. So again, trying again to make the user feel that this is something that is absolutely legitimate. So we click on our file and we download it. And I want to show you this as it exists on the system. As you can see, this is a Microsoft Excel web query file. And so it uses, again, a couple of different techniques here, right? It's an invoice. So it's coming into somebody who's used to using financial systems like Microsoft Excel. It also says it's a web query file, meaning, oh, it's going to query that external service, potentially. So we're going to go ahead and execute it. Now, one of the things that you're going to see is that it doesn't immediately come up with the yellow bar that says enable content or enable macros. it comes up with a different one that says, hey, there's a potential security concern here. By default, and this is valid for pretty much any version of Microsoft Excel these days, is that external data connections have been blocked. If you choose to enable the connection, you also choose to take on the risk of that. But your users may not necessarily be trained to notice this box versus the yellow bar that comes up above the formula bar there. So obviously the email said you need to enable this feature, so we're going to enable it. And then we get one more little bit of warning. It basically, Excel is warning you that you may have a problem here if it's going to try to execute this data. Now the interesting thing is some of this start application CMD exe, some of this can actually be modified in actual text in the script. And it's very common in VBScript or MacroScript to actually control the error to make the error text actually even look legitimate. And so, again, this is another thing, depending on your user and their training, it may be very common that they'll just go ahead and click accept and hit yes. And if they hit yes, what you see happen here is auto runs began. It started its license agreement, and we'll go ahead and click agree. But you also saw over here on the left-hand side that the reverse shell had opened even before we clicked agree. So we actually now have established a reverse command shell back to the system. And as you can see here, though, auto runs simply runs just like it normally looks. There's nothing different here. It didn't crash. It didn't do anything funky. You can still use it to do anything that you want to do with auto runs, and begin looking at whatever you want. So now that we have actually established our remote connection, we're going to do some things with it here in a moment. Let's go ahead, again, as a financial person, we might have our calculator up and running over here. Okay, so we've now seen that our system has actually connected back, and we have an open session. And if I grab this session, I can do things now like execute directory and see where I am on the system. And you can see that I'm actually on the system sitting in the documents folder because that's where this IQY file has been executed out of when it ran. There's all kinds of cool things we can do here, right? So the things we want to do is, let's see who we are. Okay, well, here's our current username. And obviously we're executing in user mode, but there's some things that we want to do a little bit later on that we want to do that are mainly kind of hidden to the system. So let's try to use Metasploit to get system access. All right, so it attempted a method, and if we try to get our UID this time, all right, you'll see that now we are running as system, which is essentially the highest level you can get on a running Windows box. That allows us to do all kinds of fun things, like we can kill processes like our calc.exe over here, and I execute the command, and you see here that calc disappeared off of the screen. All right, now let's say on our victim, we had popped open our channel marketing budget, and we've got some cool stuff showing up here on the screen. And over here on my command and control, I do something simple like screenshot. All right, so we grabbed a screenshot, and it's here sitting at this file name. And in fact, that's what we're going to use this little web server over here on the bottom left-hand corner to actually go look at. So we can flip over to our worker box, fire up our web browser over here, and basically browse, not HTTPS. We go over here to our web server, and he's running on 8090. And if we scroll down through our list, we can find that JPEG file. And sure enough, there's the JPEG of the screenshot of that marketing budget. So we've actually already begun to establish some data exfiltration by capturing a simple screenshot of what's on that user's screen. All right, So at this point, we have now established our command and control. We have a foothold on the system that we can now use to begin to do some more fun stuff with. So what do we want to do? Well, our next step is let's go ahead and gather some data from the system. Let's begin to exfiltrate some data. And then, like I said before, our goal with this one is once we're done with this, we want to try to get paid. So we want to try to get some money on top of the data that we've already yanked off of the system. And so we're going to actually execute some ransomware on the system to leave it in a very, very bad state. So pulling together everything that we've kind of done thus far is to where we're going to be right now. So we're using our existing C2 for useful things. We could obtain useful credentials for further exploitation. We now have a foothold, so we can use this as a lateral movement starting point. We can begin to explore other pieces of the system. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a trusted Windows tool to download and execute ransomware. And so we're also going to grab some credentials for the victim's online banking account using some key logging capabilities that are built into Metasploit. And we're going to do this by downloading and executing a BAT file, which again is something that a traditional endpoint security product is not going to be able to detect or scan. And we're going to use trusted Windows tools to do the execution on our behalf. So if you are utilizing something like whitelisting, the file that's being executed is actually a trusted Windows, part of Windows operating system, and will therefore, in most cases, bypass whitelisting or app locker type of controls because you're actually utilizing a built-in Windows tool as the instigating process to actually execute these things. So we're going to take a look at some of these here real quick. So the first thing that we're going to do is in the BAT file that we're going to download and execute, the first command is going to be utilizing CERTUTIL to download this malware masquerading as a Microsoft security patch, and it's going to save it out to the C drive. Then we're going to use our friend RunDLL32. Now, one of the very first Hacking Exposed webinars that we did back in March of this year, we utilized RunDLL32 and JavaScript to actually execute programs, to actually execute EXEs and DLLs and things like that. And so again, RunDLL32 is a trusted Windows application, and it can a lot of times bypass things like app locker controls because it's a trusted utility on the box. Now, one of the things that we highlighted in that webinar was that, behaviorally, if you saw RunDLL32 running as a specific user on the system, that would usually not be a good thing. And so what I've actually done on this one is I've added this last little bit to the command where it's going to execute as a user RunDLL32, but then it's also going to come by right after it and it's actually going to kill the RunDLL32 exe that is running as the user. So this one not only executes the malware, but then it's also going to clean itself up from a behavioralistic standpoint. Okay, so now it's time to go boom. It's time to take out our victim. So we'll switch back over, and we've got our command and control system here set up. We no longer need our worker. Okay, flipping back over to our victim. We've got our spreadsheet up. All right, so no, we're not going to save our spreadsheet. We're going to keep an eye on downloads folder because this is going to be where some interesting things begin to happen. Now, what I'm going to do is let's say I've got, oopsie, I have got my website running here. Sorry about that. I clicked a little too far down on the screen. Okay. We're going to bring back up Google Chrome, but this time we're going to go to, we're going to click on this, obviously on an awesome link to our bank here. It says, give us all your money. And we're going to ignore the security warning on the bank. Over on our Metasploit console, we're going to do something called a key scan. So we're going to start key scan. And on our banking site over here, we're going to log into our banking site as Stuart McClure. And we're going to type his password. All right, we hit login. Well, okay. Well, we keep getting this pop-up. But for now, we're going to just come back over to our Metasploit console, and we're going to take a look at what we have obtained. And so basically we can see, we see his username, and we can also then see the actual password that he typed and the different characters that were utilized to type the capital I, for example. There's a shift key, and there's a shift key for the exclamation point. But so we've now got some credentials we can then use to gain access to his online banking, or we can, use our key sniffer to grab Windows file shares commands and anything else pretty much that we want to do. We could also start the webcam. We could do all kinds of things to the system. But what we're going to do, now that we've got a screenshot of the marketing document for the budget, and we've got his username and password for his bank, I think we've done enough. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to drop out to a shell on the endpoint system. And you can see here I'm sitting in Windows 32. We're actually going to change directory out to users, B. Robison, downloads. All right, so now if we look at this, we can enter a dir. We are technically looking at this folder right here. You can see the only file in there is 12345.iqy, just like we have on our victim system over here on the right-hand side. Now, just like the bat file, we can use CERTUTIL from a command line to actually download the file directly from a web server anywhere on the world without the user knowing or even seeing what's happening. So we enter in our URL, and we're going to download our security scanner. Oopsie. Brain and fingers are not attached very well today. Sorry about that. All right, so we're going to use CERTUTIL to execute and download this file. Now, over here on the right-hand side, now you see the bat file actually appear on the victim system. Now, we showed you the text before, but basically this is what it looks like inside the bat file. So again, you see we're going to use CERTUTIL to actually download and store the malware, and then we're going to use run-dll32 to actually execute the malware on the system. So we're not going to save any changes to that file. But over here from our remote command and control, we're sitting in the right directory, do our dir, and we're actually going to now remotely execute the security scanner.bat. Now, over here on the right-hand side, in our victim, here in a few moments, things should start to look a little bit funnier. Hopefully it's working. It may, maybe. Oh, yep, sure enough. Now our files have been locked. And let's see our PDF here. Let's take the locked extension off. Sure enough, hey, our icons are back. Open that up. Nope, it's toast. So, yep, we have actually done our job here and have exploited our victim. We've gathered our goodies, and we've now left the victim in a now you must pay to get your data back state. All right, so what about Cylance? Now, what can Cylance do to defend against that type of attack? That is actually the topic of our next webinar. We call these Cylance versus Hacking Exposed. It'll be 2 weeks from today. There's the URL. Again, it's a long URL, but you're going to get a copy of this deck, or if you just go to cylance.com, under resources, choose webinars. But basically come back in 2 weeks and we will show you exactly how Cylance and Cylance technology protects against those different types of hacks. In the meantime, I really invite you to look at this webinar, the recording and the deck, and try some of these techniques in your own environment. Try utilizing, sending people innocuous IQY files and see what happens. See how many of them actually, download a file or do something funny like that. So just as a reminder, please enter your questions into the Q&A tab on the system, and we can answer any questions that come up.
Hey, Brian, it's Shirley. We do have a question that came into the chat box, which is...
Yep, I saw it.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep. All right, so different questions we can answer. Questions of, for example, the banking site was connecting via HTTP. Would this method work had the site been secured with HTTPS? Absolutely, it would work HTTPS. With HTTP, as those DAT files got transferred over, they would be coming in clear text, meaning that your smart perimeter defenses might be able to look at those text files and see the data that's in them. Now, as you looked at those files, there wasn't anything really in them that would look suspicious, just maybe a further URL or different commands, but it is possible that those could be intercepted in line. Why are we still using old Windows 7 boxes and not Windows 10s? We could use Windows 10s. We just choose to use, older unpatched Windows 7s to make life easy. But you'll start to see Windows 10 boxes be utilized more and more here as we move forward with Hacking Exposed going forward. So those are coming very quickly. Let's see, the user on the Windows box is a local admin on the system. So the B. Robinson user I'm logged in with is an administrative user on the system. But this type of attack, or depending on what you're deploying, maybe you've got an exploited version of calc.exe that you're using with the shellcode. You basically would land in user mode, but it really doesn't matter. You can use tools like Metasploit can get you out of user mode and up to admin or up to system, as you saw here, pretty darn simply. So it's not a difficult thing to do. Question, how early in the process would Cylance stop this sort of attack? Very, very, very early. And we'll talk about that in when we do our webinar in 2 weeks. But the way we're going to do that webinar is we're going to show you how not just Cylance Protect works, but how Cylance Optics can actually work and prevent this type of attack very early on. And the techniques that we're using in this, specifically shelter, for example, basically can bypass some elements of Cylance Protect even. So it bypasses the ability to scan the file for malware because it's a non-malicious file. So, and that's something you're also going to see as we move further along in Hacking Exposed as well. We will highlight things where that are utilized to actually bypass Cylance, because it may bypass parts of Cylance Protect, but then you've got optics available as well to help take out those attacks even earlier in the kill chain. So any further questions, please go ahead and enter those in. If not, we're going to go ahead and end here in a couple of minutes, just a few minutes early. But I really do appreciate everybody taking the time today to hang out with us and to look at a very kind of an interesting attack. But one of the things you're going to also see is that we're going to begin illustrating different methods of attacks as we go further into a lot of the future Hacking Exposed. So thank you everybody very much. I'm not seeing any further questions being asked. So thank you everybody for attending today. You will shortly get an email with the recording of today's webinar along with the deck. So again, I invite you, I challenge you to try some of these techniques internally, not just to test the technology, but to also help train your users on different types of attacks and different ways that they can be socially engineered. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end today. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And I look forward to seeing you in just 2 weeks to show you basically what Cylance can do on this type of attack. Thank you all very much. Take care and have a great day.